All right. Are we getting audio? I guess we are. You go pause this thing. Yeah. So if you look at this, just to give you an idea of what I'm looking for, you can go back for question number 1 and look at the video on Aristotle. Not the video, but the PowerPoint on Aristotle at the recording. Look at the way he portrays a virtue as the midpoint between two vices. And so this one, these actually have been fairly popular. I've used these questions for several years. Pick some of these virtues, and you want to be careful to show how he uses this as a mean between extremes, not just discuss what you think temperance is, but how does he portray these as a mean between extremes? Do you think that's a good way of viewing these virtues? Not everybody necessarily would, and how valuable are they? Does everybody need them? Just a few? Your book goes into that. So that's question 1. Question 2 is also on Aristotle's virtue ethics, you'll see. But it's on how virtues get developed. Now we're going to go over this in review today. I mean, we're basically going to do mostly review. We may introduce Descartes later. Now, one thing you will not find here is I'm not going to do anything on the problem of evil on this test. Now, I'm going to reserve the right to put some questions on the final on the problem of evil. Maybe. I got to see how much. Right now, I'm worried about, since we're burning 2 classes at the end for nothing but oral reports, we're not going to cover any, new philosophy material in those classes. And the last class is going to be final exam review, although I may do some new stuff as well that last class. I'm hoping I have enough to put some stuff on your final. So I wanted to lighten your burden a little bit on this test. There's not going to be anything on Augustine on the problem of evil or anything on Hume's PowerPoint, on the section of the PowerPoint that's on the problem of evil. Now there's going to be some on the part of that PowerPoint that's on Hume on the design argument, because we are going to, the design argument is going to be on the test. Question 2 talks about Aristotle's story about how we develop these character traits. And, you want to relate what you think that is and then weigh in on whether you think that these can be developed that way. And now I modified this question a little bit in ways that I like better, but I put the old version of it in there. I modified it to have people actually bring in an example of something that they thought was a virtue they helped develop in themselves in a similar way to the way Aristotle was. But I don't have that in there, so that's okay. Number 3 is, of course, focusing on Aquinas and the design argument. And look, we're not going to do anything on Aquinas' first 4 ways. The first 3 ways are versions of the cosmological argument. I'm not even going to get into the 4th way. But it's only the 5th way that's a simple, very early statement of the design argument. I know your syllabus talks about the first 3 ways. Forget that; they're not going to be on the test. Only the 5th way, and I've got stuff on the review sheet that we're going to go over on that. But that's what question 3 says. Is Aquinas correct to hold that the things in nature that lack a mind or intelligence and yet fulfill a purpose have to be directed externally to do this by a designer? If so, is this proof that God is nature's master designer? In other words, where do you tend to weigh in on this one if you choose this one? Do you like Aquinas' conclusion, or instead does Hume seem to you to be correct when he speculates that maybe some unknown causal principle in matter itself might direct things toward order and purpose, and not necessarily an intelligent, external, on high intelligence designer? So, okay, well, 4 focuses on Paley's version of the design argument. And I say give Paley's version in your own words. Now remember, we saw it, for those of you who were there that day, in video. But remember, even though you will not find something on Paley in the review sheet, I just haven't gotten up that. But I think Paley is so readable himself. Remember, in your basically in your where was I going with this? In the little folder in Blackboard in supplementary readings, I have some selections from Paley on the design argument. You know, and here again, you don't have to read everything in there. You know, you can play back the Tegrity file where I actually go over it, and you'll see I don't read everything and go over in intimate detail that whole long paragraph where Paley describes the inner workings of a watch, you know, because that's not the main, you know, where the main focus of the argument is, you know. But you'll notice that selection begins with Paley's crossing a heath, and coming across a watch and a stone. In other words, the part that was in the video that we saw. And what I do is I go and bring in a few paragraphs at the end where Paley gives you the conclusion of his analogy. In other words, what was it that was different about the watch that would make me refrain from saying, well, for all I know, the watch has always been there and was made by the forces of nature, the blind forces of nature. Why don't I want to say that about the watch, but I feel comfortable saying it about the stone? Well, here's where you get into the word telos. Remember, the design argument, another name for it, is the teleological argument for God's existence, because it focuses on a view of nature as imbued with things that serve various functions or purposes. So Paley says, why am I not going to give the same answer for the watch as the stone? That for all I know, it might have been there forever and produced solely by the forces of nature, because it has intricate parts that work together to fulfill a function, which is not true of stone. But then I give you some stuff later in Paley's book, in that selection of readings, where he brings the analogy home to something like the human eye. And he says, well, here's something in nature that, like the watch, has parts that seem to work together intricately to enable it to serve a particular purpose, to fulfill a function. And so there are the premises. But what's the conclusion? Well, obviously, it's that the watch needed a designer to design it to have all of those parts working together correctly to serve the function they do. And so the design argument says, well, why wouldn't something as complex as the ear or the eye also need an intelligent designer? Now we're going to review that a little bit more. But so I asked you to discuss Paley. Do you find him convincing? Why not? Is Paley right to claim that it's crazy to think that an organ like the eye is anything other than strong evidence for God? Paley's statement is that if there were no example of design in nature other than the eye, that alone would be enough to establish his conclusion about a master designer of nature, namely God. Now, at the beginning of the course, we said we want you to be autonomous and to weigh in on this. If you write on this question, it's do you agree with it or disagree? And I'm going over these to help give you some clues about what I'm thinking about when I, and what I was thinking about when I constructed these questions. But I'm also using this as part of a review too, because there was a time when I did not do a separate review sheet. I thought it was crazy. I thought college students shouldn't need a review. But everybody's doing them. In my day that wasn't done very often. And as far as a review sheet goes, what I was saying is I now provide a review sheet. I used to tell students, look, use the question pool as a sort of review sheet, because the things that I'm focusing in on when I'm asking you or giving you those essay question options are the very same things, the important points that I might construct objective questions, true or false or multiple choice questions on to ask. But we do have a separate review sheet, so I'll give that out shortly. And I had a question about sample questions, Um, yeah, I know, like Microsoft gives sample questions for all of its exams. But usually my practice has been to just give a sheet of sample questions before the first test, because at that point a student in one of my classes has not seen and might not have a clear idea of how I might ask an objective question in philosophy. And so I give them some examples of that. But after you've had a real test under your belt, you have a pretty good idea of how I might ask an objective question in philosophy. So that's for, now, 5 obviously, centers around the ontological argument, and it asks you to bring in both versions of it. But, even if you just use one version, you want to show how the fool, right, the denier of God's existence, is supposed to be led into contradictions by accepting the concept of God that the argument deals with and denying its conclusion. So 5 has to do with the actual versions of the ontological argument itself. 6, excuse me, I don't have a cough switch or anything, so I have to deal with it. In radio, you have a button that's called a cough switch, right? If you do that, you press the button and it kills your mic, so your sneeze doesn't go out over the air. All right, back to his number 6. Relate either Guinillo's criticism, and your book pronounces his name Guinillon. It's the only text I've ever used that doesn't pronounce it Guinillo, but either way, we're just going to assume for philosophy 101 purposes that Guinillo or Guinillon are both correct. So here I give you a choice. I'm saying I either show how Guinillo criticized Anselm's version of the ontological argument, or Immanuel Kant criticized Descartes' version of it, and did you think that they were on target with their criticisms? And those are in the PowerPoint. Okay, so there's no essay. I had a student from morning class ask me about an essay option on the problem of evil. I will give you one on the final, whether or not I put objective questions on the problem of evil on it. I didn't want to confuse people by telling them on the one hand there aren't going to be any objective questions on test 2 on the problem of evil, and then throwing an essay option there. Okay. Any questions over that? Let me go pause. So again, there will be 25 questions. I hope I remember to number them they'll probably be numbered beginning with number 51, just to remind you that you want to use a different part of the Scantron form. And you do want to get your essay in on time. There is a 10-point penalty for late essays, and you know, I mean, late essays have a way of falling through the cracks this time of year because there's so much going on. You know, but also I have so much other grading to do that, you know, I really need to try to get essays in on time from everyone. Okay, so the ontological argument. So it gets its name from the Greek word ontos for being. There is an area of philosophy called ontology, which Aristotle says is the science or the study of being qua being, of existence itself. And this is the kind of thing that we saw the pre-Socratics doing, right? But the idea is that this argument for God goes from a mere concept of who God is, a concept about the being of God, and leads to a conclusion that the being who fits that concept exists, or in the modern version must exist. So because it goes merely from an abstract concept and does not depend on any observations about the world, like the argument from first cause, or like the design argument, it's an a priori argument. And a priori arguments, like the kind we see here, like the one we saw in Parmenides, try to show with logical certainty, with mathematical certainty, that their conclusion is true. In other words, they try to give an airtight proof for their conclusion. Whereas a posteriori arguments, like the design argument, are probabilistic. All arguments from analogy are merely probabilistic. There are other types of probabilistic arguments, statistical arguments, than arguments from analogy. But the point is, in a probabilistic argument, even if the premises are true, the conclusion can still be false, even if it's a very strong argument from analogy. Whereas in a deductively valid argument, an a priori argument, if the premises of an argument are true, then they guarantee that the conclusion has to be true as well. In other words, it would be a contradiction in that type of an argument for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And you'll see this is exactly what both Anselm and Descartes tried to show against somebody who denies God's existence. They try to show that if they accept the concept of God that they're dealing with, then it will be a contradiction for them to accept the concept that the argument begins with and reject the conclusion that God exists. It's like something's blown in there. Okay, so a priori basically means prior to and independent of experience. A posteriori, you can see the word post in there, means after or based on experience. Again, ontological argument is a priori. The other arguments like the cosmological and design arguments are a posteriori. So cosmological arguments, and let me repeat for people who walked in late, even though Aquinas' first three ways, which are all versions of cosmological arguments, that is, arguments that try to say God must exist because the cosmos, the universe, needs a necessary first cause, and God is that first cause. But the design argument, as I said, is also called the teleological argument, from the Greek word telos, or purpose. And this stuff is in the PowerPoints. So now we're doing the ontological argument, and it's called ontological because the Greek word ontos, for being, as we said, they start out with a concept of who God is, of God's being. Who's the fool? The denier of God. And again, Anselm is just quoting a verse from the Psalms in the Bible that says, what?
Why is it called that?
Why is the ontological argument called that?
Yeah.
Because the Greek word hoantos is a Greek word for being or existence. And the ontological argument starts out with a concept of God that describes who God is, God's being, God's existence, right? Either by listing the properties that belong to God, like Descartes does, or by getting out a concept like Anselm does of God as the greatest being we can possibly think of or imagine. Yeah, because you're going from an abstract concept. In other words, that's what gets your argument underway. You're going from that to a conclusion about what exists, namely the being that concept is about. Whereas something like the design argument depends on observations about how things actually are in the world. That yes, there are things like the eye and the ear in the world that have parts that work together to serve a purpose, stuff like that. The cosmological argument, trades on the fact that we look around and we see that things don't just happen out of the clear blue sky in nature. They need causes. And so you trace causes back.
Those arguments are discussed in the PowerPoint? Are they discussed in the book too?
Yeah. Again, specific pages are listed in your syllabus for homework. But there's very little on Paley. That's why there's something in supplementary readings on it. But no, those are good questions. And folks, feel free to raise your hand. Stop me. But because it's a review session, really the best way for me to conduct a review session, but I never seem to be able to do one of these, would be for me to just ask you questions, That's my standard professor's line about the review sheet. At best, the only thing I'm ever going to provide you with is the second best review sheet you can get. As opposed to the first being the one that you make for yourself from your notes and stuff as you're reading. Say, that sounds like something a professor would say, doesn't it? But it's true. It really is. You'll learn more by trying to get up your own review sheet than you ever will from trying to follow mine. Okay, back to Ontos being here. So the concept of God's being that Anselm uses is it's a very convoluted phrase in English, right? God is that than which none greater can be thought. One of my former textbooks used to say, it's the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. I mean, think about it. As far as monotheism is concerned, what could possibly be greater than God? Okay. Pardon? So the fool is a denier of God, but okay, we want to show where the contradiction lies. But first, why does the greatest imaginable being, why must that being exist, not just as a concept, but in reality? Folks, this is something you find very often. An unstated assumption is snuck into an argument. When we teach informal logic, sometimes we try to get students to put in not just the stated premises of an argument, but a premise or premises they think are assumed in the background, but by the arguer, but not stated. And basically, we saw that Plato thought that something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist, or that there were degrees of existence, right? So it's Plato that ties this notion of a thing's being great or morally good or perfect with the concept of its existence. And if you can see that, you can see how he would say, well, wait a second, it is much greater for something to exist in reality than just to exist as a mental concept. Note, for Plato, greater for something to exist even in this world than just a rendering of it, an image of it, a concept of it. And of course, the illustration that I put in the PowerPoint that Anselm gives himself is if you take a painter who has a concept of the painting he or she wants to paint, and then you take the finished painting after it has been painted, Anselm would say, well, which is greater? Just the concept that was in the painter's mind, or the actually existing, real world version of the painting after it's been painted? So the idea is that to exist in reality is greater than to exist merely in concept. And if you get this, then you have to say, well, what is the concept of God we're working with? Well, it's the concept of God as the greatest being we could possibly imagine. Well, the point is, to qualify as that, a being has to exist by this Platonic assumption in reality and not just as a mental concept. So, one of my grad school professors, James Cargill, used to say, Anselm has a concept of God here where, if you come to him and you say, well, I have a concept of God in my mind as the greatest being I can possibly imagine. And then some would say, well, does that being exist? And if you say, well, no, I don't think so. And they say, well, whatever concept you have, it's not of the greatest being that you can think of or imagine. It's the only way you can get to be that is to exist in reality and not just by concept. Okay? So he's trying to say, if you buy into the concept of God as the greatest being you can think of or imagine, that than which none greater can be thought, you would contradict yourself if you then went on to say, but I think that being exists only as a concept and not in reality, if you were a denier of God's existence. So the idea is, you can't buy into the concept of God as the greatest being and deny his existence. You have to accept the conclusion if you accept the premise. You're backed into a corner, in other words, on this argument. So if the fool accepts Anselm's definition of God, going back to the review sheet, what else must the fool accept? Well, he's got to accept that the being that fits the definition has to exist in reality and not just in concept in the mind. Otherwise, that being you're talking about would not qualify as the greatest being you can imagine. So, I always thought Anselm's version of this was much harder to get your mind around than Descartes'. Descartes' is nice, laid out, and well organized. Yeah, go ahead.
So that answers the question before that, why greatest imaginable being must exist not just as concept but in reality, because otherwise you contradict yourself?
Well, the idea is it's greater to exist in reality than to exist only in concept, right?
That's the answer.
But if what we're working with is the concept of the greatest being you could possibly imagine, how can something fit that concept without existing in reality if it's greater to exist in reality?
Mm-hmm. And a contradiction if you didn't.
Yeah. So if the fool buys into the concept of God as the greatest being you can imagine, he's got to also buy into God's existence.
Right, I got that. I just wasn't sure about the one before that.
Okay. Did you see how the one before that is supposed to go?
Right.
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens generally in this kind of an argument. It always is a contradiction to accept the premise or premises of a deductively valid argument and deny the conclusion. Okay. Now, how does Guanillo reply? With a strategy that when we teach logic courses, and I'm not gonna ask you this, but the technique is called refutation by logical analogy. They say, well, wait a second, we're talking about the design argument being an analogy. What's the difference between an analogy and a logical analogy? Anybody gonna weigh into that? Somebody taking logic right now? Well, basically, the reason we have a separate subject called logic is that you can assess arguments as good or bad arguments solely by looking at their structure, at their form. In other words, a good argument is a good argument logically, no matter what that argument is about. In other words, you can do what you do in algebra, right? You can substitute variables for what the argument is about and display its form, its abstract form, right? So a logical analogy is an argument, or what you do in developing a logical analogy is to try to develop an argument that has the same logical form as the one you're criticizing, and then show that there's something wrong with your analogical argument. And if that's the case, then there must be something wrong with the original argument. And you say, now come on, these guys were medieval guys. These are medieval monks. For God's sake, do you really think they got that technical logically? Yeah. All these guys did besides tend their gardens and brew wine is basically, study, the scriptures, but also study logic. They push the envelope in logic quite a bit. So what is this technique then as it applies to the ontological argument? What Guanillo tries to do then is get out an argument that seems to prove something very suspicious or absurd. And what is that? Pardon? Yeah, the most he says, right. If from the mere concept of God as the greatest possible being we can imagine God's existence should follow, what about the existence of the greatest possible island paradise we could think of? Shouldn't it have to exist in reality in order to qualify as the greatest possible island we can conceive? But you can see how this is suspicious, right? We shouldn't be able to prove from an abstract concept of the greatest island conceivable that the thing must be out there somewhere in reality. There's something very suspicious about that. And so Guanillo says, this argument that I'm talking about, trying to prove the existence of the most perfect island, has the same logical form, the same structure as your ontological argument. So if there's something suspicious about being able to prove that the most perfect island actually exists out there in reality from the mere concept of the most perfect island, then Anselm, Buddy, remember Guanillo was one of his fellow monks, there must be something wrong with your argument, is what he's trying to say. We shouldn't be able to prove God's existence in reality from just the concept of God, like you think you can do. Remember, it's one thing to believe in God, it's another to believe that somebody's argument that they claim proves God really does the job. St. Thomas Aquinas, why do we look in his 5 ways and we don't find a version of the ontological argument? It's because Aquinas was suspicious of these types of a priori arguments as well. So what could similar reasoning also prove the existence of? Well, for Guanillo, it would be something like the most perfect island. Why is this a problem for the ontological argument? Because if the analogical argument seems very suspicious and unsound, then so should the original ontological argument, if they have the same form. Now, I've never been very satisfied with Anselm's reply, but basically, and I think your book says something more about this, if somebody has ever recalled, but I think basically what he says is, look, the case of God is unique. Your analogy, Guanillo, doesn't quite work. That existence is functions differently when we're talking about the greatest possible imaginable being, when we're talking about the existence of God than the way it functions for the existence of something like the most perfect island. And I think what Descartes does is he takes that response into consideration when he develops his own argument. Because Descartes' argument tries to say that existence is a necessary property of God in a way that it isn't of other things. So Descartes. Now, when we look at Descartes after the test, we're going to see that the context in which he brings in his version of the ontological argument is a context where he has just used every skeptical argument he can imagine to try to doubt all of his former beliefs to see if he has any beliefs that are beyond doubt. And at this point, in Descartes' reasoning, we will see later, he has doubted the independent existence of the real material world. So if he's going to prove God's existence, he cannot do it using the design argument or the cosmological argument, using any a posteriori arguments, because those depend on facts about the world, and in Descartes' skeptical reasoning, he can't even defend the existence of the external world. So he has to go with an abstract a priori argument, and really he uses more than one. He also uses an abstract version of something like the cosmological argument, where he tries to prove that his own innate idea of God is so perfect that it can have only one cause. And it's not something in the world, and it didn't come from nothing, and it's too perfect for him to have been the cause of his perfect idea of God, must have come from God himself. Now, that's another abstract a priori argument he uses. But now, I don't want to get you off on a tangent, but here, in using the ontological argument, he tries to say that existence is so integral to who God is that it's like the importance of three sides and three angles to the existence of a triangle. You know, I could draw a triangle on blackboard, right? Right? You can draw a triangle. Now, it's not essential to a triangle that it be colored blue or white, right? And I make this point in the slides. But it is essential to a triangle that it has three sides and three, interior angles adding up to two right angles. And just as it's necessary, absolutely necessary, for something to be a triangle, that it have three sides and three angles, Descartes is going to argue that when we're talking the concept of God, we're going to see that existence is absolutely necessary to his being. And so what is the concept of God's being that Descartes uses that makes existence absolutely integral to who God is in the way that having three angles is to what a triangle is? Well, for Descartes, it's the concept of God as a supremely perfect being, right? The being that, as they say in the 20th century, is the sum of all perfections, possesses all perfect qualities. And I showed you a list of God's qualities. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, merciful, omnipresent everywhere. And what I showed is that for Descartes, you're not going to have a complete description of God as the being that possesses all perfections unless you include existence as one of those perfect qualities, along with omnipotence and omniscience and the other qualities of God in traditional theism. Now, what happens when you put existence into the list of God's perfect qualities? Well, note, then, if it's part of the concept of God as being the supremely perfect being, that God possessed the quality of existence, then you can't buy into the concept of God as the supremely perfect being and then, without contradicting yourself, deny God's existence. Because if God possesses all perfect qualities, existence turns out to be one of them. And we saw that Immanuel Kant's criticism says that no, that's not the way existence functions. It doesn't add anything to the description of something to say that it exists or it doesn't exist. If I describe my car out there in the parking lot, I would not add one thing to the description of my car to list at the end, oh, and by the way, it exists, after telling you that it's blue and it's a Chevrolet and da-da-da-da-da-da, right? What Immanuel Kant says is existence is not a quality of a thing. And when we say something possesses a quality, this mouse is black, this glass case is brown, this ginger ale bottle is green, I'm predicating blackness of the computer mouse, brownness of the glasses case, and greenness of the bottle. When we say something has a quality, we say that we predicate that quality of the thing. Now, why is that important? Because for Descartes, existence is one of God's qualities and it functions logically as a predicate, as a quality that God has. What Immanuel Kant says is no, existence is not a quality in the list. It doesn't belong in God's description. Existence functions outside of the list. First you describe something with all of its qualities, and then afterwards you talk about whether what you just described either exists or doesn't exist, but existence is not one of those qualities. As Kant puts it, it's a precondition for things having any qualities. In other words, in order for my car out there in the parking lot to be blue or have a four-cylinder engine, or have any other properties. It has to exist. But existence is not a property in my car's description that it has. But it has to exist in order to have any properties. So how do we get out of the contradiction then, taking Immanuel Kant's thing? Well, it was putting existence in the list of God's properties that gave us the contradiction. Because if the concept of God as the most perfect being included that God must exist, possess existence, then it was a contradiction to buy into God as the most perfect being and deny existence. And so, if we take existence out of the list, it's no longer part of God's description, then we can talk about God as possessing all perfect qualities, and then talk about whether the being we just described either exists or doesn't exist without contradicting ourselves, if we take existence out of the list, which is what Immanuel Kant does. Now, what I said is that the version that I think was first advanced in the 50s or 60s, 1960s, the contemporary version of the argument gets around Kant's criticisms, but I'm not going to go into that because I'm not going to ask you anything on it. And so that's the ontological argument. I should have gone down to Hume before. Let me pick. Let's back up. I was asking myself whether I ought to cut and paste this. I probably should have. Again, on that PowerPoint with Hume's criticisms of the design argument is also a discussion of the problem of evil. But I said, on this test, I'm not going to ask you any questions on the problem of evil. On Hume's statement of the problem, or on what your book and what we discussed about Augustine. There may be some questions on the final, but I wanted to cut down the amount of material on this test. So here, remember, Cleanthes is a character in Hume's very controversial book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And Cleanthes is kind of like the deist. He's a very intellectual person in Hume's time. Remember, Hume lived about the time of our founding fathers, late 1700s. And Cleanthes wants to be a very intellectual believer who puts a lot of stock in things like the design argument. But as I said, his name is a made-up name that includes the Greek word for man or human beings, hoanthropos, right? You know that anthropology, based on the same Greek word, is the study of human culture, right? And theos, the word for God. So he's somebody who wants to say that God has human, characteristics, like intelligence, and also, that he's loving and merciful, etc. Did somebody have a hand up? No. Okay. Well, describe the basics of the analogy was compared to what? Well, see, Hume, while he discusses the things that Cleanthes brings up as examples of design, like the eye. Cleanthes brings the eye up as an example of design. But Hume thinks the actual analogy of the design argument is one that compares the universe as a whole to manufactured objects like houses and ships and, yes, watches. And he thinks it's a good argument to compare, as we say, apples with apples. You know, if I say, well, look, I wasn't around when anybody designed and built my house because the records were lost in the Baltimore fire around 1900. But I don't have any doubt that somebody designed and built the house. It didn't just grow there, you know, out of nature on that plot of land, right? Other houses we've seen needed a designer and builder. My house must have needed the same, right? Hume says when you're comparing apples with apples, you have a very strong analogy and you have strong evidence. So he says if you're comparing blood flow in one human being to another, you've got very similar cases. Hume doesn't quibble with the claim that the design argument is an argument from analogy. He says that's okay because there are some really good arguments from analogy when we're comparing very similar cases. But his point is, the farther away our comparisons, the worse our argument is. See, probabilistic arguments, unlike a priori deductive arguments are either good or bad. There's no middle ground. But probabilistic arguments run a sort of gamut in the amount of evidence they furnish for the conclusion. You can have a good, very strong probabilistic argument or a very weak one. And Hume is trying to argue that the design argument is a very weak analogy because it compares manufactured objects like houses to the universe as a whole. And he says that's not comparing very similar things. But, you know, here again, he doesn't discuss the kinds of things Paley centers on, where Paley says, yeah, but let's talk about the analogy between a manufactured object like a watch and an organ in the human body like the eye. And he says, well, there are a lot of analogical similarities there. You know, you've got parts intricately working together to serve a function or purpose, you know. And so I think one of the questions you have to raise is, well, is Paley focusing on stronger analogies than the ones Hume wants to criticize? Okay, so one line of attack Hume makes then is to try to show that you're comparing apples with oranges in the design argument, the universe to something like a house, and that it's a bad analogy. Because Hume says, look, if we compare things that have only superficial similarities, like a vegetable stalk that has tubes that sap flows in, and blood in the human body, you could be led into a totally wrong conclusion. That sap doesn't circulate in trees and vegetable stalks the way blood does, in a body. And so he's saying, if the design argument is that kind of a very bad analogy, then it's not a good argument. So in the design argument's analogy to what is the building of a house compared, well, it's basically to the design and making of the universe. So again, Philo's view of this analogy is what I just gave you, that it's a weak analogy based on comparing things that aren't very, very alike. Does order always imply design? Now, this is another tact he takes. He's saying, well, even if we concede that there is order in the universe, he tries to say that the design argument focuses on only one possible cause of order, namely intelligent design by a designer. Whereas he tries to say there might be principles in the fabric of nature that tend to produce order. Now, remember, Hume's a non-scientist. He's a philosopher, but he knows something about the science of his day. And so I bring in that PowerPoint some of the forces Hume speculates about. He says, look, we've got forces in nature like thermal forces, heat, forces like magnetism. He says, why couldn't there be forces in nature, maybe undiscovered, that are responsible for order and design? He says, isn't it at least conceivable that that could be the case? And if so, then the design argument would be wrong to say, well, intelligent design is the only possible thing that can explain the existing order. And of course, post-Darwin, the Darwinian story, I mean, you've had it drummed into you in things like high school biology for years, right? Of how it is that we have the complex eyes we do, right? Over millions of years of progressively more complex organisms, you have organisms that adapt to their environment and have very advantageous variations that give them a leg up in the evolutionary struggle for survival, and evolution selects those members of the species, say the ones that develop better eyes, for survival over others, and progressively this non-directed random process by adaptation and natural selection, through simple, non-directed forces in nature produce us, or produce our eyes, as basically a happy accident. I mean, that's Darwin's original view. We are here as a happy accident. I gave you the illustration about dice and backgammon, right? That shaking up dice in a dice cup and throwing it is running a random process, right? But I don't get the same result every time I throw the dice down. Otherwise, it would be a very boring game, right? And contemporary evolutionists say, hey, if we ran the whole process over again from scratch with no guarantee it would produce us or anything like this. So anyway, yeah, go ahead. I don't know of a passage where he says that, but that would be interesting if you want to do a Google search, it would be interesting to see what he did. Um, what I thought is Darwin actually started out a believer, but then kind of got more naturalistic rather than the other way around. But I mean, you can have a concept of evolution divinely directed. It's called theistic evolution, right? It's not a contradiction. And also, I mean, to be a believer in God and to believe that God created the universe, you don't have to accept Usher's chronology either. Say what? Usher's chronology is, do you know what it is? There's a man named Usher in the 700s who followed out all the genealogies in the Bible, all the so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, back to Adam and tried to figure out how many years these people lived and all, and came out with the date of creation that some people today, and maybe some people in this class, I'm not trying to step on toes, accept. And the date was 4004 BC, or BCE, if you prefer. In other words, the earth is around 6,000 years old. There are people today who believe that. And there might be people in this room. But, not every Christian theist accepts what's called the view of the earth as being very young. I mean, personally, I think it's consistent with the concept of divine omnipotence, that God could have created the world and all of our memories to be just what they are right now, last Saturday afternoon when he got bored on his lunch break, and it only looks like the earth is 13 billion years old. But the question, but, I would go on to say, but from all the evidence, does it really seem like that's what happened, So, I know, it's wearing going. I rarely do more than an hour and a half on review. So, I thought it's been so long, we just came back from break. I thought, well, I'm gonna do a review and record it and, see. Now, it's 7:15. We can take 15 or 20 minutes, or we can just roll. What would you all like to do? You want to take a little break? Is your mind becoming mush? You want to just roll with it? Because pretty much all we have is Aristoteles. I don't think I'm going to show the video on Descartes today. We'll save that for next time. We did Aristotle's Ethics, okay? Now, folks, what I have in your review sheet, because when I was trying to get up Aristotle's Ethics, which I didn't have a review sheet component for, I was trying to think of it, and this was a few years ago, and I thought, well, wait a second. What could I do? Why reinvent the wheel? What could I do trying to structure a review sheet anew that's better than what I already have in the PowerPoint? So, what you see here, what you see is what you get. Okay, what you see, this is what you would get in the outline view. Because what you have in your review sheet is the outline view of the PowerPoint on Aristotle's Ethics, the whole PowerPoint, which lets you know how little content there is. Remember, a PowerPoint, right? Point as in point in a bullet point in an outline. All PowerPoints are glorified outlines. Shatter your world here, but the first PowerPoints I ever did, I took some outlines I already had and went the other way on them. So we're not going to worry much about intellectual virtues, but this goes to say that there are intellectual and moral virtues goes in with Aristotle saying that human beings have a chief purpose or function. And for Aristotle, the essential nature of a thing is bound up with its technia, with its purpose or function. And for something to, in other words, the essence of a knife is that it's an object designed for cutting things. Or, the essential nature of chalk is that it's designed for writing on blackboards, right? The point is, Aristotle has this view of nature, and so did Aquinas, and so did Paley, because it also, syncs very well with a concept of God having designed nature with things having purposes, right? So what Aristotle talks about as virtue is not just moral goodness, but excellence, living an excellent life. What is an excellent life? How can we define what it is for a human being to live a really excellent life? Because if a thing does or fulfills its function well, then the same word that we translate virtue is used to describe a knife that fulfills the function of cutting well. Now, I told you when we went over this before, we don't talk about a knife being virtuous, right? But we do apply a non-moral concept of good to a knife that functions well, right? If I say, look, hand me that knife over there, I gotta cut through this chicken bone, and I need a really good knife to do it, i.e. a knife that's gonna perform the function of cutting well. Don't give me that old, dull knife over there. I don't want to work that hard, right? So the point is, and the word is arete, but we're not throwing too much Greek at it here. The idea is, when Aristotle talks about virtue, he's talking about human excellence. What is it to live an excellent life? Be an excellent human being. It's not just a sort of goody two-shoes version of goodness here. And very much like Socrates and Plato before him, he's more interested in what is it to be a good human being than he is in moral questions about how I decide whether A or B is the right thing to do when I'm faced with this particular moral dilemma, right? And he talks about some of the same virtues. Remember, for Plato, we had three parts of the soul, right? And the virtue attached to our lower nature, the appetitive element of our personality, is self-control or temperance. And Plato says that when reason rules over, when we allow our reason to rule over the desires of our lower nature, then we become temperate individuals. We practice self-control. Likewise, he says if we allow reason to rule over the emotional part of our nature, we're not overly aggressive when we shouldn't be. We can fight our fears and, the virtue of courage, he says, is associated with our emotional part, the spirited element, and of course wisdom with the intellectual part. Aristotle then, how does he cut new ground out over Plato? Well, it's in this model that we see down here. But, where he portrays a virtue as the midpoint between two vices, one of deprivation, one of excess. But, back up a little bit. Aristotle believes that we can develop virtuous character traits, and as I tried to put on the board before, you have to think of this as being like a circle. In other words, when we practice making the right kinds of decisions, making temperate decisions in the area of food and drink, or making the courageous choice. And he says it's doing that allows us to develop a character trait. But then once we've developed that character trait, it becomes easier to make choices that are in line with being a courageous person, being a temperate person. So he thinks we acquire virtues not by going off and meditating on the form of the good, or meditating on the pure form of temperance, but we acquire them by actually doing things, making choices that are in accordance with the virtue we want to develop. So they're acquired by exercising them, and he said, that's what makes virtues, this is why we had the endless piano player, analogous to other skills. Now, some people misunderstand the point of his analogy. He's not saying you can develop virtues like self-control by learning a musical instrument. What he's saying is developing a virtue is like developing a skill at something like being a carpenter or being a musician on a particular instrument. That it's developed over time and with practice. That's where his analogy is. And so he says we learn to build by building. And I said I still have stuff that my dad made when he was learning to be a carpenter in the late 1940s on the GI Bill. Right? We learn to play a musical instrument like a lyre by actually doing it. When I was learning to play guitar, I would drive my brother nuts because we were watching television stuff and I'd be practicing songs. and I'd be doing the same thing over and over again because that's the only way you get it down right. Now my brother was actually a very good rock drummer, but he didn't have his drums in the house; they were out in the garage. But he was more than a garage band musician. He actually played a lot of very good bands in the area. But anyway, to get back to this, so we become virtuous persons by performing virtuous acts. So that makes moral virtue a social enterprise. We don't become virtuous just by going off and meditating, but by actually making the right choices in our interactions with other human beings in the real world. I mean, this is Aristotle's view. Aristotle's a very practical, down-to-earth kind of guy. So as I said, we become morally just by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings. So, again, this is where Aristotle cuts out new ground. Now, the Greeks talked about the golden mean, about moderation in all things as being something we ought to follow. But Aristotle gets out this model of a virtue as a midpoint, a mean between two vices, which are excesses, one an excess of too little, the other an excess of too much. One an excess of deprivation, the other an excess of excess. That's, an extreme, maybe I should say, two extremes, okay? So there's his general model, and then what you see under it are some specific examples of the way he portrays these virtues, right? That self-control or temperance in the area of food and drink is a midway point between asceticism, which would deny the needs of the body, like mystics who think they can live on air, right? And gluttony and drunkenness, excess on the other hand. So Aristotle says the correct approach is moderation, the moderate mean. Likewise, courage is the midway point between fearing everything, between being very cowardly and fearing nothing, being foolhardy. So the person who has no fear, for Aristotle, is not really the courageous person. They're just kind of foolhardy, and they'll probably get themselves killed earlier than they should. Whereas courage is experiencing fear but controlling it. And how do we keep things in control? Well, this is where Aristotle brings in our reasoning abilities. It is our ability to reason and to use, our reason, what he thinks is the essential human part of us, to bring it into play. Our rationing abilities is, our reasoning abilities are what enabled us to walk this moderate mean, to make those choices, and to go against nature sometimes, right? Nature would make us fearful when we're trying to develop a more courageous disposition. But by reasoning, we say, no, I've got to confront the boss about the raise, next week. Need to do the courageous thing, right? And so for Aristotle, reason is important to the moral life. The moral life is a life governed and controlled by reason. And that's how we achieve the mean. So the mean is often achieved contrary to nature, right? If I'm trying to develop self-control or temperance, I say, I'm just going to have one piece of that cake. I'm going to put the rest in the refrigerator. And then you're saying, oh, I could really go for another piece of that cake. And nature wants you to go for it, and you say, no, I'm trying to develop more self-control in that area. Trying to get on top of my sugar addiction. And so, by your reasoning abilities, you fight nature and you say, no, I'm not going to have that same piece of cake or pie until tomorrow. Okay, so the mean is often achieved contrary to nature and achieved by bringing in our reasoning abilities. And for Aristotle, this is what is uniquely human about us. We saw, and I gave you that little diagram. Remember, a thing's essential nature for Aristotle is defined by its chief function, what it does uniquely. In other words, a good knife might cut something very well. That's its essential function. It might do a lousy job of trying to write on the blackboard. So Aristotle says, well, look, if virtue is connected with the things performing its essential function or being in line with its essential nature, well, excellently, well, we have to ask, well, what is the chief function of human beings? And for him, the one thing that separates us from non-human animals and plants is our reasoning abilities, right? The plants have biological functions, but not an emotional life and not reason. Non-human animals have an emotional life like we do, but not reason. But we as human beings are the only people that have, and non-human animals have biological functions. But only we humans have biological functions and emotional life, sentience, and the ability to reason. So he says it's our rational abilities that are unique to what we are as human beings. And we saw this in Plato, right? Reason is that part of us that's most godlike. That's why reason should rule over the body and why the most rational people in society in Plato's ideal state should rule over everyone else. Now there are problems with this, with connecting our humanness to our reason, that I don't want to go into, but they surface even today in things like medical ethics. If it's our reason that makes us human, I told you I once saw a video where Father Joseph Fletcher, a medical ethicist who in my day when I was in college wrote the book Situation Ethics. He said people with Down syndrome, they can't reason. They're not human. They're not fully human. I mean, what about people with Down syndrome? What about infants? Infants don't have fully developed rational abilities. Are they something less than human until they, come of age? Or what about the other end of life? What about somebody who has Alzheimer's and loses their ability to reason? Are they now less human than they were? Well, if it's only our ability to reason that makes us human, then, you'd have to say yes to some of those. But would you want to say yes? That's the problem, And so, even today, this idea of whether we should define our humanness by pointing to our rational abilities is a controversial thing, right? Pardon? Well, so at any rate, yeah, right. What, you guys are leaving? You see that the movie is about to end and you're getting up and leaving? Yeah. Well, all right. There's not. I'm not going to go much into happiness. The only reason he talks about happiness as the chief end of morality, not knowing some abstract form of the good. Because remember, for Aristotle, there is no abstract form of the good. And so, when are we happy? He picks happiness as the standard because he says that is what we seek for its own sake. That is what's good for its own sake alone, not just because it promotes some other good. And so, what Aristotle tries to say is, if we're living the moderate life, the life of excellence, the answer to the question, why be moral, is for him that it's also the happiest life for a human being. And so achieving moral excellence and achieving happiness for Aristotle are sort of one and the same, so virtue is its own reward for Aristotle. The virtuous life, the happiest life. And so the happiest life for Aristotle is a life of moderation. One of my, college, well, actually, it wasn't even college, but a friend of mine from the 70s had this old Joe Walsh album, where there's a really funny song on it. I heard it the other day on the radio. What's it called? I don't know what he calls it. It's like, the hook is, life's been good for me so far. But he talks about all the trappings of fame and success.
Yeah, I like that song.
Yeah, that's 185. I lost my license, now I don't drive. He says, I have a mansion, with gates. He says, I haven't been there. They tell me it's great. I live in hotels, tear out the walls. I have accountants to pay for it all. Life's been good for me so far. But, Aristotle sort of has the same way, for him, the happiest life for a human being is not necessarily the life where you're going overboard to excess, but the moderate life, So, something to think about. So, virtue is walking the moderate mean between extremes, and it's, for him, also the happiest life for a human being. And, folks, there our story ends. Right, if we took, it's just, really, it's only finishing 20 minutes early. Because the point is, if we took a 20-minute break, it would be like finishing 5 or 10 because it's probably going to be better to show you the video on Descartes when we're ready to go over. That's where we're going to go next. We'll do some on Descartes. But folks, be thinking about your talk. I didn't print out a thing, but the talk is there. I will probably illustrate one next week. Not before you do the test. Because if you were like me as a college student, you're always worried. You want to get to the test at the top of the hour because you're afraid that knowledge is going to leak out before you get to express it on the test, right? Okay, so bring a number 2 pencil, although I'll have some. And I will bring the Scantrons. So your essay is due a week from today. Okay. So and if anybody missed getting the essay questions, they're here. Just pick one up on your way out. And if you missed the roll, it's also here. Thank you very much for coming. Let me stop integrity file.